Welcome back to the channel, you curd nerds. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the world of navigation technology that was fundamental in reshaping IFR flying. Today, we're going to be talking about RNAV and GPS. Now, right off the bat, I want y'all to tell me what you think RNAV is. But we're still going to talk about it in this video, but just put it in the comments. What do you think RNAV is? Now, we can't really talk about RNAV unless we also talk about PBN or performance-based navigation. We're also going to talk about required navigational performance and WAAS. We're going to break down each and how they relate to each other and how they are applied to IFR flight, especially when it comes to approaches. So by the end of this video, you'll have a clear understanding of each concept and we'll be able to apply this knowledge to approaches, which is where these systems really shine. But also, stay tuned for a future video where we talk about these systems in reference to cross-country planning. So grab your charts, grab your cheese curds, and let's dive right in. Right off the bat, performance-based navigation, or PBN. This system was officially introduced by the FAA, or Federal Aviation Administration, in 2006, and it marks probably one of the biggest shifts in modern aviation navigation. But to understand why PBN was necessary, let's take a quick step back. So before PBN, all IFR navigation relied on ground-based navaids, things like VORs, NDBs, and ILS systems. These systems were dependable, but they came with limitations. For instance, because VORs are ground-based, they generally lock an aircraft onto a fixed airway that follow the locations of these navaids. So you're flying across country like you're zigzagging across the map rather than taking a direct route. Obviously, it's not the most efficient way to fly. The fixed nature of these routes also meant that in many cases, the aircraft had to stay at specific altitudes to stay within the range of the navaid's signals or service volumes. This was particularly challenging in remote or mountainous areas where the navaids could be few and far between. As air travel increased, the aviation industry recognized a need to change the navigation system so that it was more flexible and efficient. This is where PBN came in. PBN changed things by setting a basis of standardization for RNAV and RNP. It outlined the requirements of aircraft and navaids, whether they were space or ground-based, to ensure signal coverage to open more point-to-point flying routes in locations where traditional navigation coverage may just have not worked. In short, PBN is the basis of all area navigation systems, which are broken into two more groups, really RNAV and RNP. Now that we have an understanding of the framework of PBN, let's really take a look at RNAV, or area navigation. In essence, RNAV allows us, again, to fly more point-to-point without needing to directly overfly ground-based navaids like a VOR. You can think of it as point-to-point navigation that lets you kind of create your own route in the sky. This flexibility is incredibly valuable because it eliminates the rigid structure of traditional airways. The RNAV does this by listening to all nav sources available to that RNAV system. Your Garmin 430 is a GPS RNAV system, meaning that it only takes in GPS signals for its RNAV position determination. But when you look at something like the CRJ200, it tries to determine its location by grabbing 6 DME signals before it ever looks at GPS or VORs. It'll even try to use ADFs. There are other RNAV systems like inertial reference units, but I really doubt that any of y'all are going to end up experiencing those until you get into an airliner. So now, RNAV capabilities adjust your en route phase of flight as well. As we said, traditionally an aircraft would have to fly along Victor Airways or jet routes, which are defined solely based on ground-based navaids at the time. Think tracking a radial from VOR to VOR. But RNAV opened the door to more direct routes, usually referred to as Q routes or T routes. Q routes are typically used for higher altitude operations in Class A airspace, while T routes are found at lower altitude areas, often replacing traditional Victor Airways. These routes often take advantage of GPS signals instead of being confined by the positions of VOR stations on the ground. For example, let's say you're flying from Atlanta to Dallas. In the past, you might have to follow a zigzagging route due to navaid placement. But with RNAV and Q routes, you could fly a direct path, saving time and fuel. This has been particularly beneficial in regions with sparse ground-based infrastructure, like over oceans or remote areas. RNAV has truly unlocked a new efficiency in navigation. But as good as RNAV is, there are certain environments, think rugged terrain or obstacle-dense areas, where we need even higher levels of precision. And this is where RNP comes into play. RNP, or Required Navigational Performance, takes RNAV a step further by adding onboard performance monitoring and alerting systems. Essentially, RNP is RNAV with additional safety layers. The big idea is that RNP specifies an acceptable margin of error in an aircraft's navigation. For example, an RNP approach would have a requirement of RNP 0.3, which means the aircraft must remain within 0.3 nautical miles of its intended path. The added element here is performance monitoring. The system constantly checks the aircraft's navigation accuracy, and if it detects that the plane can't maintain the required accuracy, it'll alert the crew. This system will notify the crew if the required navigational performance for the departure, arrival, or approach is not met. This level of precision and monitoring is especially useful in high-risk areas such as mountainous regions where obstacles could be close to the flight path or during instrument approaches into challenging airports. Take, for instance, the approach into Juneau, Alaska. The surrounding terrain and variable weather makes traditional approaches tough. By using an RNP approach, pilots can safely navigate through the mountainous areas with precision, staying on the designated path while being alerted if there is any deviation beyond acceptable limits. This is why you'll often see RNP approaches at airports with challenging terrain, high-density airspace, where even the slightest deviation could lead to some serious consequences. So far, we've been talking about RNAV in a broad sense. Now let's dig into the type of RNAV system your training aircraft most likely has: GPS, or Global Positioning System. This system is comprised of at least 24 satellites in low Earth orbit that are essentially sending out a signal with a timestamp. The receiver in your aircraft receives the time-stamped signal and compares it to the current time, estimating the distance from the satellite based on the difference between when the signal was sent and when the signal was received. It uses multiple satellites all together to try and figure out your location. If we have 3 satellites, the receiver can generate a 2D location of where you are on the surface of the planet, but not how high you are. With 4 satellites, you can get a 3D position, which is enough for basic navigation, especially under VFR. For IFR, though, we want more. We want RAIM, or Receiver Autonomous Integrity Monitoring. This allows the receiver in your aircraft to determine the quality of the signal it's receiving from the GPS satellites. To accomplish RAIM, we need at least 5 satellites. But what would happen if one of those satellites sends a faulty signal? We would obviously lose RAIM, and the receiver would give us a RAIM fault flag. If we add one more satellite, the receiver can now perform what's known as fault exclusion by kicking out the faulty satellite. We can also reduce these satellite requirements by 1 if we add a baro-aided altimeter. By letting the receiver compare the static port's readings with GPS data, it can be more accurate and estimate the aircraft's altitudes and detect errors in one of the satellites. Now, RAIM is great for en-route IFR operations, and it can even accomplish some approaches. But next up is WAAS, or Wide Area Augmentation System. WAAS essentially is a GPS enhancement that improves the accuracy and reliability. Without WAAS, standard GPS accuracy might be about 30 to 50 feet of your intended position. WAAS, on the other hand, can get you within 3 feet or less. This is a huge improvement, especially when we start talking about approach minimums. WAAS works by having ground stations around the country that receive GPS signals from space. These stations send data to a master station, which looks for any errors and applies corrections. These corrected signals are then beamed back up to geostationary satellites, which maintain a fixed position over the Earth. These satellites then send the corrected signal along with more pseudo-range signal, like a normal GPS, to enhance the accuracy. This increased performance opens the door to new approaches. WAAS is essential for achieving something called localizer performance with vertical guidance, or LPV. LPV approaches give you both lateral and vertical guidance very similar to an ILS like we discussed in this video. The difference? LPV doesn't require ground-based infrastructure like an ILS. Instead, it uses GPS signals corrected by WAAS to provide accurate, stable guidance down to minimums as low as 200 feet AGL. So with a WAAS-capable GPS, you could fly an LPV approach to small airports without needing an ILS. This expands IFR capabilities significantly, especially at airports without the budget or space to install ground-based navigation aids. WAAS is a game changer, making precision approaches or precision-like approaches accessible to more airports, giving pilots reliable options for safe landings. Now, here we are in November 1 Hotel Tango, actually on a plan to go into Juneau, Alaska, like we talked about earlier in this video. Juneau, Alaska is a perfect example of why RNAV is amazing. There's a lot of obstacles around, and if you look at the IFR in route chart, what you'll notice is that if all you had was VORs, you would have a lot of mandatory reporting points. You would actually have to stay at a substantially higher altitude of 7,000 feet. But since we have RNAV, we're able to go on the Tango route, which takes our in-route altitude down to 4,400, like we're going to right now. We're currently heading to Biku and then going to Sister Island VOR for the GPS runway 8 into Juneau. If you want to follow along, the identifier is Papa Alpha Juliet November. Now let's hop into the airplane and take a look at what we got all loaded up. So if we look over at our flight plan, we can see we're heading to Biku and then to SSR, which is our sister island VOR. And then from there, we're going to head on to Nimli, and from Nimli, Ojimi, and then Mene, and then down to our missed approach point of Mahler. Down to minimums of 1,880. We do need 2 miles of visibility, and it does look like we're going to have a 2.2 mile visual segment for this approach. Looks like our final approach course is 15 degrees off from our runway, so we'll keep that in mind when we do break out. The runway should be kind of catty-cornered off to, looks like we're going to see it kind of off to our right. And if we, for some reason, don't break out, for some reason we end up having to go around, it looks like it'll be a climbing left turn 9,000 direct to Muggs on a 281 track to chill and hold. Continue climbing in hold up to 9,000. Missed approach requires a minimum climb of 363 feet per nautical mile to 3,200. And we should be able to accomplish that in this Bonanza. Awesome. Let's keep this descent coming down to 4,400. And I'll meet y'all as we start getting closer to our descent profile at Ojimi. All right, now here we are approaching the SSR, or the Sister Islands VOR. Now, if we look at our approach plate, it does seem like we can go down to 3,400 at this point. So we'll go ahead, engage our indicated airspeed descent profile, or descent mode, and we'll go ahead and reduce power. Now, it does appear as though the airplane has calculated a glide path for us, or a path down, a V path down this approach. So we can also arm our approach mode and let the airplane, correction, we can arm, nope, I was right. On this one, we can arm approach mode. I believe we may even have a button over here for VNAV, glide path, or V, and let the airplane follow its plan. One of the big features of RNAV with a barrel-weighted altimeter is our VNAV path. Now, this is a G1000, so of course it's got an amazing avionics package. A lot of the RNAV systems that you're going to encounter in the cheaper realm aren't going to have RNAV path. They're not going to be able to generate a VNAV path for you. You're going to either have to calculate one yourself and set it as part of your descent rate, or do some dive and drives. Dive and drives way out here aren't necessarily unsafe. They get a little unsafe as you get closer and closer to the airport. You get closer and closer to the ground. But here we are, 3,400 at SSR, on our way to Nimli. Nimli looks like it's 1.7 miles away. And once we get past Nimli, it does look like from Nimli, again, it's 3,400. And we're not going to get another descent until we get to Ogami, or Ojmi. I don't know. Ogami. Sure. Ogami. Let me know if you know how to pronounce it better than I do. There's Nimli, still 3,400 to Ogami. Looks like we're about 7 miles. If I look over on my multifunction display over here, looks like I'm about 2 minutes, 20 seconds from Ogami at my current speed. Now, we are in pretty smooth air from what it looks like, so creeping on up into the yellow arc isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just realize that we are currently burning 22 gallons, 22.7 gallons per hour. And you can see all of the elevation over here on my multifunction display that we're avoiding with this RNAV path. This isn't something that we could really do with like a VOR. For us to accomplish this with ground-based navigation aids, we would probably need a VOR on like a VOR over here, maybe directing us in there. I mean, I know we've got this VOR right here, but this VOR really can just get us to about here, unless we want to stay at a super high altitude to cross this fix. So maybe we would need another VOR on maybe one of these islands to bring us in. But remember, as we get farther and farther from a VOR, its path gets wider and wider. So we need to make sure that even at full scale deflection, we're high enough to avoid all of these obstacles. But since we've got RNAV, which is using GPS currently, we don't have to worry about, do we have a VOR? Do we have a ground-based nav aid that's going to work for us? Now, looks like we're reaching Ogami or Ogmi. Once we get past Ogmi, Then we're going to descend down to 2,700. The airplane now grabbed its own V path, so it's going on down to 2,700. I'm going to go ahead and set my missed approach altitude of 9,000 at this point. And I'm also looking out to make sure when I do end up getting down below these clouds and I do get to my visual segment, well, I know where I'm going. Given that my visual segment's 2 miles, I feel like I can delay any kind of flap or gear extension. I mean, 2 mile final, it's pretty far. Still plenty of time for me to get gear down, get flaps down. Looks like I'm 0.5 from Mene, which is my final approach fix. And the airplane has grabbed the glide path. It's on the way down. Going down to my minimums of 1,880. Let's go ahead, bring this power back. I'm below gear extension speed. We'll go ahead and drop gear. Go ahead and set my props full forward, mixture full forward, and looking for the airport. Missed approach point is 4 miles away. And I see the runway in sight. We'll go ahead, disengage our autopilot, drop a notch of flaps, reduce power, a little bit of trim. Then we'll really try to follow this glide path that the airplane's already got for us down. I can also try and get over, kind of shift over, see if I can get the pappies in sight. Go ahead and get my last notch of flaps in. And I am all ready to land. So you can see, it would be really hard to accomplish this approach with just traditional ground-based navigation aids. With all of these obstacles, remember, VORs, ADFs, NDBs, they all need line of sight for you to be able to get that signal. If there's a big old mountain blocking that VOR, it's not going to work. You're not going to get that signal. If there's a big old mountain blocking an ILS, you're not going to get that signal. So we see how vital and how important this RNAV and RMP and PBN really is to the future of air navigation, of just aircraft navigating in IFR conditions. That looks like a water runway off to the right, if I've ever seen one. Just getting a little low. We'll add some power to correct for that. And it's a simulator. We'll ignore the opposite runway traffic. A little bit of float, not bad. And then maybe we can clear before that opposite runway traffic gets here. So we can really see how VORs, NDBs, ILSs, traditional ground-based navigation aids wouldn't have really been able to accomplish that style of approach. If we were to try and do that with ground-based navigation aids, the lowest that we could have gotten is 3,200 for our approach, and we would have needed 4 miles of visibility by looking at the LDA X-ray for runway 8. But given that we had RNAV, we had GPS, we got down to minimums of, I think it was 1,800. Yep, 18 or 1,880 with 2 miles of visibility. That's a whole lot better. I don't know what else to say about that. It's a whole lot better. We can actually get down to a reasonable altitude to make these landings, making Juneau I don't know, a little bit more of a reasonable airport to try and operate in and out of IFR. So, as always, this is intended as supplemental instruction. I am a instructor. I am not necessarily your instructor. So if you do want to go fly around using RNAV, using GPS, under the rules set forth by performance-based navigation or PBN, go get instruction with an actual instructor or a ground school like Pilot Institute. And as always, keep it cheesy.